July 1st, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, New Guinea. The heat rose off the crushed coral runway in shimmering waves. 6.5 hours in the air had left every man aboard the returning flight, wrung dry eyes, bloodshot lips, cracked throats, burning from recycled oxygen and adrenaline. 4 twin-engine P-38 Lightnings came in low over the jungle, silver glints slicing through humid air, thick with the smell of fuel and dust. Lieutenant Paul Red Parker brought his Lightning in first wheel, screaming as they bit into the runway. His fuel gauges trembled near empty needles, barely flickering above the red. He taxied toward the dispersal area canopy, sliding back, face shining with sweat. Behind him, another P-38 touched down, then another. Their props spun down with the weary whine of machines run to the edge. But the 4th aircraft, that one seemed different. It rolled in slow and steady, both engines still humming at a calm, even note. The pilot was no officer. His khakis were faded, his helmet an older civilian type with cracks in the leather. The man was Charles A. Lindbergh, the same Lindbergh who'd once crossed the Atlantic alone in the Spirit of St. Louis, and who in his 40s had somehow found his way into the Pacific Theatre as a civilian technical advisor. When the ground crew approached expecting another near-empty tank, the crew chief frowned. The dipstick came up wet, then again, and again. "That can't be right," the chief muttered. "Check it again," one of the pilots said. He did, and found over 210 gallons still in the tanks. The men stared dumbfounded. They had all flown the same distance, the same route, the same weather, yet Lindbergh had returned with nearly double the fuel left. On that steaming afternoon in New Guinea, surrounded by rows of war-weary Lightnings, a quiet question hung in the air like the smell of avgas. How had Charles Lindbergh broken the laws of both physics and the Army Air Force's manual and lived to most of the young fighter pilots at Hollandia? Charles Lindbergh was more myth than man, the lone eagle, the first to cross the Atlantic. His face had once filled newspaper front pages and postage stamps. Now here he was, a 42-year-old civilian in khaki trousers and a sun-bleached flight cap flying combat escort missions with men half his age. Officially, he wasn't even supposed to be there. Lindbergh had been hired by United Aircraft and later by Lockheed as a technical consultant sent to the Pacific to train pilots in extending the range of their P-38 Lightnings. The Army Air Force's command had allowed him to observe operations but not to fight, still in the skies over the Bismarck Sea and the Japanese-held islands, beyond observation often blurred with combat reality. The 475th Fighter Group, the Satan's Angels, had learned to respect him quickly. He didn't strut or lecture. He listened. He walked the flight lines at dawn, studying maintenance logs and engine charts. He sat with crew chiefs in the shade of revetments, running his finger over the black-smudged manifolds of the Allison V1710 engines. He asked questions about mixture prop pitch and manifold pressure not out of curiosity, but because he already suspected something was deeply wrong. American pilots had been trained one way: follow the manual. The manual said do not exceed 46 inches of manifold pressure at 2600 RPM, do not run over square, maintain auto-rich mixture for cooling and safety. Deviation meant engine failure or worse court-martial. But Lindbergh's instincts told him otherwise. For months he'd studied flight test data airspeed curves and fuel flow charts. He knew that the Allison engines could handle much higher manifold pressures if the pilot compensated with lower RPM and leaner fuel mixtures. It was counterintuitive, even heretical. Lower revolutions meant cooler pistons. Higher pressure meant greater torque, less wasted fuel, more range. To prove it, Lindbergh didn't write a memo. He climbed into a cockpit. That July morning, the mission was routine. A long-range fighter sweep over the Halmahera Islands. 6 hours out and back, no margin for error. Lindbergh flew in the number 3 position of the 431st Squadron, alongside Captain Larry Slug Owens and Lieutenant Red Parker. They followed standard climb procedures to 24,000 feet throttles, set to 2200 RPM auto-rich mixture as prescribed. But once they leveled off, Lindbergh began killing his engines. He dialed back the prop governors to 1600 RPM. He nudged the throttle forward to 30 inches of manifold pressure. Then with a steady hand he pulled the mixture levers into the auto-lean detent. The others glanced at him across the formation. His props seemed to slow his airspeed steady, but his exhausts burned cooler paler. "Lindy, you're going to cook those Allisons," Owens had radioed. "No," Lindbergh answered calmly, his Midwestern accent flat over the static. I'm going to get home with fuel to spare. Hours later, he did with almost 200 gallons more than any of them. Back on the ground, when the crew drained his tanks and verified the figures, it wasn't disbelief anymore. It was awe. He'd flown over square, breaking every rule the army had taught, and his engines hadn't just survived, they'd thrived. The next day, word spread through the 475th like wildfire. Mechanics whispered it first, then the pilots tried it. Then the squadron commander wanted a demonstration. Lindbergh's technique wasn't magic. It was physics, the kind the manuals had oversimplified out of fear and bureaucracy. And soon one civilian was about to change how an entire air force flew across the Pacific. But before the method could spread, it had to survive its first true test, a mission where fuel economy wasn't just a luxury, it was life or death. July 28, 1944, over the Seram Sea. The ocean below looked like beaten steel, unbroken, endless, and terrifyingly empty. 20 P-38 Lightnings from the 475th Fighter Group roared eastward in tight formation, silver and grey against the clouds. Beneath each wing hung a pair of drop tanks, each filled with 165 gallons of high-octane fuel. Their target, the Japanese garrisons around Palau, nearly 700 miles from base. That kind of range bordered on suicidal. Even with external tanks, most Lightnings returned with barely enough fuel to taxi. One navigation error, one unexpected headwind, and the pilot would be swimming home if he lived long enough to ditch. Captain Larry Owens led the flight. Beside him, tucked into the number 2 slot, flew the tall reserved civilian whose very presence defied military logic. Charles Lindbergh, the man who killed his engines and came back with fuel to spare, now sat in the right-hand cockpit of P-38 Miss Virginia II. The roar of 2 Allison V-1710 engines filled his headset. The temperature gauges climbed oil shimmering under the tropical sun. Lindbergh studied the dials with a calm that unsettled the men who flew with him. To them, this wasn't a technical experiment, it was a knife-edge mission into enemy airspace. To Lindbergh, it was data collection at 250 miles per hour. At 22,000 feet, the formation leveled off. Set your power at 2600 RPM, 36 inches. Owens called over the radio standard cruise procedure. Lindbergh didn't answer. Instead, he reached forward, twisted both prop levers down to 1600 RPM, and eased the throttles up until the manifold pressure needles climbed past 30, then 32 inches. His exhaust tone dropped into a low, throaty hum. Cylinder head temperatures fell 10 degrees. His fuel flow gauge steadied at 68 gallons per hour, 30 less than his wingman's. He smiled faintly inside his oxygen mask. "You're crazy," Lindy Owens muttered across the channel. Maybe Lindbergh replied, "But if we get back with gas, maybe I'm not." For the next 6 hours, the Pacific stretched out in hypnotic monotony. Sky cloud ocean, the occasional shadow of an island slipping by beneath them. As they approached Palau, the formation split 8 ships duffed toward the airfield at Koror. The rest stayed high, covering against the inevitable swarm of Zeros. Below, the tracers began to rise. Lindbergh followed the dive bombers down to 15,000 feet, then 10,000. The air turned violent black bursts of flak, the sharp glint of Japanese fighters climbing out from the west. He throttled forward 46 inches manifold RPM, steady at 1600. His P-38 responded like a coiled spring acceleration instant torque, smooth. He flicked the gun switch and pressed the trigger. 6 50 caliber Brownings chattered their shells walking across the wing of a diving Kai-43. The Oscar burst into flame and spiraled into the sea. Over the radio came a stunned voice. "Lindbergh's got one, the civilian just bagged a 0. He said nothing. He was already scanning his fuel gauges. They read 270 gallons, remaining incredible. Enough for the long, perilous trip home. By the time the Lightnings formed up again and turned westward, 2 American aircraft had been lost, one to flak, one to engine trouble. The survivors throttled back to maximum economy, praying their fuel would last the 700-mile stretch to New Guinea. Hours later, as dust settled over the jungle ridges of Hollandia, the formation limped home one by one, fuel needles hovering near 0. Yet Lindbergh once again rolled to a stop with 190 gallons, still sloshing in his tanks. The mechanics crowded around him in disbelief. "He's doing it again," one said. "It's witchcraft." "No," another replied, watching Lindbergh climb down from the cockpit with his flight logs tucked under his arm. "It's science." That night, under the flicker of oil drum fires, pilots argued around their mess tables about compression ratios, mixture settings, and risk. Some swore they'd never run their engines over square. Others quietly began adjusting their habits. And up in the operations hut, Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the 475th, made a decision that would ripple across the entire Pacific Air War. The next morning, all squadrons were ordered to report for an experimental briefing. The instructor, Charles Lindbergh, July 29, 1944. Hollandia Air Base briefing hut. The corrugated tin walls rattled in the morning heat as 24 pilots filed in khaki shirts, darkened by sweat pencils stuck behind ears. They expected another dry lecture on fuel economy. What they got instead was a masterclass in mechanical empathy delivered by the man who had once flown alone from New York to Paris. Charles Lindbergh stood beside a grease-stained chalkboard. Behind him, a disassembled Allison V-17 Thyssen cylinder head sat on a crate, valves gleaming in the light. He began without introduction. "Gentlemen," he said, voice quiet but cutting through the drone of ceiling fans, "everything you've been taught about your engines works, but it doesn't work best." A few pilots smirked. The manuals they knew were gospel. Lindbergh picked up a piece of chalk and drew a simple diagram, piston crank propeller lines, crisp and deliberate. "You've been told never to run over square, never let manifold pressure exceed RPM divided by 100. But the Allison's compression ratio and its detonation limits allow more. At low RPM, the pistons move slower, the valves stay closed longer, and you get better volumetric efficiency, more push, less friction." He turned, wiped his hands on a rag. "At 2600 RPM, you're burning over 100 gallons an hour. At 1600 RPM and 30 inches, you can fly the same speed on 70. That's 30 gallons you don't have to ditch over the sea. Someone from the back called the tech order says that'll blow our bearings." Lindbergh smiled faintly. "Then my bearings should have been dust halfway to Palau." Laughter broke the tension. The men leaned in. He continued explaining mixture control, how auto-lean was not the enemy, but an ally if used carefully at altitude. How the reduction in propeller tip speed reduced vibration and drag. How every ounce of fuel saved was another 20 miles of life over an empty ocean. Then he reached into his logbook. "Yesterday, same mission profile as you all flew last week. You landed with fumes. I landed with a third of my fuel still aboard." He let the silence hang. On the blackboard, he chalked out a new setting. "Cruise 1600 RPM, 30 inches, auto-lean cowl flaps cracked 1 inch. Try it. Not all at once. Ease into it. Listen to your engine. Feel it." He looked up at them, the same steady eyes that had watched the Atlantic dawn rise in 1927. "Gentlemen, the airplane talks. You just have to stop shouting long enough to hear it." Outside, thunderheads brewed over the jungle. By afternoon, the test flights began. One by one, P-38s taxied out, shimmering in the heat haze. The first few pilots were cautious, nursing their throttles, glancing nervously at cylinder head temps. Then came surprise. The gauges dropped, not rose. The vibrations eased. The range indicator ticked slower. The airframes seemed to breathe easier, as if grateful to be flown by reason instead of ritual. By evening, the radio chatter across the squadrons was a mix of disbelief and admiration. "Mac, you're not going to believe this. I still got 100 gallons left. Feels like the ship's gliding instead of grinding. Tell Lindy I owe him a drink or 10. That night, Colonel MacDonald signed a memo to 5th Air Force Headquarters subject. Field engine management results Lindbergh method. Observation. Increased radius of action estimated 30–40%. Recommendation. Immediate evaluation for all twin-engine fighter units. Within weeks, word spread far beyond Hollandia to the Philippines, to the 433rd, 475th, 8th, and 49th fighter groups. Even Navy pilots in their Corsairs and Hellcats began experimenting with Lindy settings. For a man officially barred from combat, Lindbergh was quietly rewriting the combat manual. Yet the test that would prove or destroy his theory came soon enough. A deep penetration strike across the South China Sea where no lightning had ever reached before. A target so distant fuel was measured not in gallons but in prayers. August 4th, 1944, Mokma Airstrip, Biak Island, dawn. The first light of day crept over the palms, painting the aluminum wings in molten gold. Mechanics moved like ghosts through the thin mist, tightening cowling bolts, checking fuel caps, tapping gauges. A flight of 9 P-38 Lightnings waited on the coral runway, their bellies loaded with bombs, their wings burdened with drop tanks that groaned under 330 gallons of aviation fuel. The target Balikpapan, Borneo, a vital Japanese oil centre nearly 900 miles away. It was farther than any Lightning mission yet attempted. The men called it Operation Longstride, half in jest, half in dread. They knew the math. A P-38's combat radius under standard procedure was barely 570 miles. Even with drop tanks, they'd have to push limits that manuals called unsafe. Every pilot knew what a dry engine over the Makassar Strait meant, a flaming ditching in shark-infested waters. Charles Lindbergh volunteered to lead the navigation leg. Colonel Charles MacDonald didn't like it. "You're a civilian, Lindy." If something goes wrong, Lindbergh cut him off quietly. If it works, it won't go wrong for anyone else. At 30 hours, the formation lifted off engines roaring against the still dark sea. They climbed through a rising haze, throttles forward, propellers singing. By 12,000 feet, the horizon flamed pink, and the mission began its long, silent endurance run. Each man flew by the book except one. Lindbergh dialed back his props to 1600 RPM, throttled forward to 30 inches manifold, leaned his mixture until the engines whispered instead of shouted. His Lightning P-38J-25 serial, 44-23964, sliced through the humid air with uncanny smoothness. Cylinder head temperatures dropped to 215 degrees. Oil temp stabilized. His fuel flow gauge showed 68 gallons per hour. The others, still flying safe at 2200 RPM, burned through more than 100. Over the next hour, something remarkable happened. One by one, the pilots in his element began matching his settings. RPM down, throttle up, mixture lean, and the gauges began to obey. At 800 hours, they crossed the equator. The sun burned white on the water. The cockpit smelled of hot aluminum and sweat. Below, black oil plumes rose from Balikpapan's refineries, the Japanese fuel lifeline feeding their fleets in the Celebes Sea. The bomb run came fast and brutal. Flak burst in dense black spheres. A P-38 on Lindbergh's left wing took a direct hit and vanished in a blossom of flame. The rest dove through curtains of smoke, dropped their loads and pulled hard toward the sea. Engines screamed. Fuel gauges dropped. But not Lindbergh's. He throttled back, stayed low over the water, and began the long return leg, 900 miles of ocean. No alternate fields, no second chances. For the first 2 hours he flew in a radio silence. The others checked in, occasionally clipped nervous transmissions about fuel state. Red 2 showing 50 left. Red leader. "I'm down to 30, might not make it. Lindy here, I've still got 170. The channel went quiet. The disbelief was palpable even over static. As dusk approached, thunderheads formed in the west. The air turned to molten soup. Lightning flashed across the horizon, turning the world into a black and white photograph of itself. Lindbergh climbed to 12,000 feet, punching through the cloud tops. The sky above was an endless sea of orange and violet serene detached from the chaos below. When Hollandia's coastline finally appeared faint and ghostly on the horizon, he checked his gauges, 90 gallons remaining. He throttled back to idle and glided the final miles, wheels touching down just as the sun sank behind the jungle. The other Lightnings followed, sputtering on fumes, one engine dead, another, coughing black smoke. When the ground crew measured his tanks, they found 82 gallons left. He had flown farther than any operational P-38 in the Pacific and returned with enough fuel to circle the field twice. Colonel MacDonald was waiting on the ramp, cigarette unlit expression halfway between awe and irritation. "Lindy," he said, "if you weren't breaking every damn rule we've got, I'd make you a major tomorrow." Lindbergh smiled, his face lined with exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. "Rules are fine, Colonel," he said softly, "until they keep you from getting home." That night, word reached General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force. Within days, Lindbergh's over-square method was formally tested, documented, and circulated. Range tables were redrawn, combat radius extended by nearly 200 miles. Pilots could now escort bombers deeper into enemy territory, strike new targets, and return safely. But perhaps the most striking proof of all would come weeks later, when even the Navy called Lindbergh to teach their Corsair pilots a few impossible tricks of their own. September 10th, 1944. Emerald Island, Bismarck Archipelago. The Navy didn't take lessons from civilians easily. especially not from one who'd once been accused of sympathizing with isolationists back home. But by late summer 1944, even the most skeptical officers had heard the rumors spreading across the Pacific. A 42-year-old man with no rank was teaching fighter groups to double their range, and his engines lived to tell the tale. When Charles Lindbergh stepped off the transport at MRO rows of bent-wing F-4U Corsairs gleamed in the sun like sleeping predators. Their pilots leaned sunburned, wary-eyed him with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Lieutenant Commander Bob Hawk Harper, a veteran of the Solomons campaign, broke the silence. "So you're the fellow who can make an Allison sip like a priest? You think you can tame a double wasp too?" Lindbergh grinned faintly. "I don't tame engines, Commander. I listen to them," Harper barked a laugh. "Then let's see if the Navy speaks your language." By afternoon the test was on. A formation of 6 Corsairs taxied out across the pierced steel runway, their Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines rumbling with that deep throaty rhythm that shook the palms. Each carried external tanks for a long-range patrol 900 miles out and back. Lindbergh climbed into the rear cockpit of a 2-seat trainer variant to demonstrate the settings. The Corsair's power plant was a different beast from the Allison V1710, air-cooled with a supercharger that demanded respect. But the principle Lindbergh explained through the intercom was universal. Less speed, more distance. You trade noise for endurance. Once airborne, he signaled the pilots to level at 20,000 feet. The flight spread wide over the ocean sunlight flickering off the canopies. Harper kept his eyes glued to his gauges as Lindbergh's calm voice came through the radio. "Bring your prop levers back to 1800 RPM. Now ease the throttles forward 30 inches of manifold. Mixture to auto lean. Cal flaps 1/4. Watch your temperatures." The pilots hesitated. Years of training screamed that running high manifold at low RPM risked detonation, the oversquare taboo again. But they obeyed. Within minutes the change was undeniable. The rough vibrations smoothed. Cylinder head temps fell. Fuel flow dropped from 115 gallons per hour to 80. The Corsairs seemed to settle into a tranquil hum, as if cruising downhill through the sky. Harper's voice broke the silence. "Well, I'll be damned. She likes it." Lindbergh chuckled. "Engines like to work smart, Commander. Not hard." They stayed out for 5 hours longer than any previous patrol. When they returned, ground crews confirmed what the gauges had promised. Each aircraft landed with a third of its fuel still on board. That night in the officers' mess, disbelief turned into quiet respect. Over mugs of bitter Navy coffee, Harper approached Lindbergh. "I don't know how you figured it, but you just gave these birds another 100 miles of reach. Maybe 2. That means our boys can cover the bombers to the Philippines." Lindbergh nodded. "Then that's worth every minute of argument." Within weeks, the technique spread from the Corsair squadrons to Marine air groups to carrier decks across the Pacific. Pilots started referring to it in code Lindy Cruise. It wasn't just about saving gas. It changed how they thought about flight itself. Instead of treating their machines as brute instruments of war, they began to feel them sense the pulse of the engines, the balance between pressure and rhythm power and patience. By the end of 1944, Lindbergh had logged more than 50 combat missions in P-38s, P-47s, and Corsairs, unofficially yet openly enough that his name appeared in squadron diaries. His logbooks recorded everything: power settings, fuel flows, temperatures, prop efficiency. To him, every mission was both flight and experiment, and the results were rewriting the manuals in real time. But the quiet revolution he had sparked was about to meet its most brutal test, an operation that would demand every ounce of range precision and courage the Pacific War could throw at a fighter pilot. The Philippines were next, and the skies over Leyte would show whether killing your engines could truly win a war. October 28, 1944. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The dawn broke over a sea already on fire. Below the wrecks of Japanese destroyers still smouldered survivors of Admiral Kurita's retreat. Above contrails curled like scars across the blue, the new battlefield of the air. The American invasion of the Philippines had begun, and every available fighter group from Luzon to New Guinea was being drawn into the storm. Among them was the 475th Fighter Group Satan's Angels, now operating out of Tacloban airstrip, a muddy, hastily carved strip of steel matting still glistening from overnight rain. The jungle pressed close on all sides. Supply trucks growled. Pilots drank coffee from tin cups blackened by engine soot. And in the middle of it all stood Charles Lindbergh, still a civilian clipboard in hand, briefing a group of young lieutenants who had only weeks of combat experience. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady amid the background roar of engines warming up, "this isn't about dogfights. It's about endurance. If you run your engines like the manuals say, you'll make it to the target maybe. If you run them the way I'll show you, you'll make it home." He turned to the blackboard, chalking out numbers that had become legend across the Pacific. Cruise 1600 RPM, 30 inches manifold, auto lean. The settings looked harmless enough until one realized they violated nearly every wartime directive on engine safety. Captain Larry Slug Owens, now squadron leader, raised an eyebrow. "We'll be flying top cover for the bombers over Ormoc Bay. You sure this'll get us back?" Lindbergh smiled faintly. "It got me back from Balikpapan. That's twice as far." An hour later, the flight of 12 P-38s streaked off the deck wheels, folding into their nacelles, twin tails cutting through the tropical haze. The bombers they escorted, B-24 Liberators from the 90th Bomb Group, were lumbering toward their targets, Japanese convoys moving reinforcements through the narrow channels of the Visayas. Lindbergh flew in the number 3 slot, calm hands on the yoke. The radio chatter crackled in his headset, the clipped rhythm of combat men masking nerves with routine. "Red leader, to all flights level at 23,000. Watch your temps, it's hot today." The Allison engines purred steadily beneath him. He glanced at his gauges, manifold 30 inches, RPM 1600 mixture auto lean, cylinder heads 220 Durul, oil 75 Durul, perfect. Through the canopy, he could see the shimmering green coastline of Leyte sliding beneath the wings, then the deep blue of the Gulf stretching into infinity. In that moment, Lindbergh understood the strange poetry of the Pacific War, where endurance was courage and silence often louder than gunfire. 2 hours into the mission, a shout burst over the radio zeros. 2 o'clock high, diving black dots appeared against the glare. 6 Japanese A6M5 zero sunlight glinting off their wings arced down toward the bombers. The formation scattered, Brownings rattled, traces streaked across the sky. Lindbergh banked left throttles forward to 46 inches RPM, still low. The lightning responded instantly, smooth control deadly. He lined up on the lead. Zero squeezed the trigger, and the 6 50 caliber guns stitched a white line through the sky. The Zero erupted into flame, but as he pulled back into formation, he saw a P-38 trailing smoke, losing altitude fast. Lieutenant Peter Coyle's voice came through, panicked. "I'm hit port engines out, losing pressure." "Feather it," Lindbergh ordered. "Cut your RPM 1600 on the right 32 inches manifold. Keep her level." The others listened as he calmly guided the young pilot through a power management sequence that defied training manuals and saved his life. Coyle limped back to Leyte on a single-engine landing safely with just 10 gallons left. The rest of the flight rejoined escorting the bombers home. When they landed at Tacloban, the ground crews were astonished once again every Lightning still had fuel in its tanks. In the logbooks that evening, someone scrawled a note, "Lindy's Law, run her quiet, she'll bring you home." By November, Lindy settings had become doctrine, spreading across the 5th and 13th Air Forces. Range tables were rewritten. The P-38, once criticized for its short legs, suddenly became the longest-reaching escort in the Pacific. Fighters could now accompany bombers deep into Japanese-held territory, to Mindanao, to Formosa, even to the outskirts of China. Lindbergh himself, still officially a civilian consultant, had become something more, a teacher, a mentor, and to many pilots a kind of living legend who proved that intuition and science could coexist with courage. But as 1944 drew to a close, even Lindbergh knew his time in combat was ending. Washington had begun asking questions about why a civilian was flying combat missions and how many Japanese aircraft he had personally shot down. Still, before he was ordered home, he would fly one final mission, a sortie that would test everything he had taught and leave even hardened combat veterans speechless. December 12th, 1944. Clark Field, Luzon. Rain swept across the tarmac like a curtain, drumming against the aluminum wings of the P-38s, lined up for takeoff. The air reeked of wet oil cordite and the sweet rot of jungle. The monsoon had turned the airstrip into a swamp, but orders were orders, one more long-range strike against Japanese supply lines, retreating toward the northern coast. Charles Lindbergh zipped up his flight jacket, slid his chart into the clipboard, strapped to his thigh, and climbed into the cockpit of P-38J-15, serial Fortour Force 150. The name painted beneath the canopy read Put Put Maru, Officially, he was still a civilian consultant. Unofficially, he was about to lead his final combat mission. Colonel Charles MacDonald stood beside the plane, rain dripping from his cap brim. "You sure you want to do this one, Lindy? You've proved your point 10 times over." Lindbergh smiled faintly. "One more, Colonel, for the record." MacDonald hesitated, then offered his hand, "Then make it a good one." At 600 hours, the formation of 8 lightnings lifted into the grey, their twin booms trailing vapour in the rain-drenched air. They climbed north toward the mountains, engines throttled back to Lindbergh's familiar rhythm, 1600 RPM 30 inches. Manifold auto-lean mixture. The gauges were steady, the engines calmed the sound more like a heartbeat than a roar. Their mission to strike Japanese transports moving along the Cagayan River Valley. Distance nearly 700 miles round trip. Expected flight time 6.5 hours. To most, that was a stretch. To Lindbergh, it was just another proof of principle. 2 hours into the flight, the weather thickened. Cloud banks rose in towering walls, lightning flashing deep within. Visibility dropped to a few hundred yards. The formation broke into 2 elements to stay clear of collision. Through the mist, Lindbergh caught sight of enemy movement. Columns of trucks and river barges creeping along a jungle trail below. He rolled into a dive, throttles forward, RPM unchanged. The lightning howled down through the rain like a hunting bird. His guns opened up 650s, hammering the valley floor. Explosions rippled along the convoy. One barge erupted into a ball of orange flame that painted the clouds from beneath. Pulling out low, his left wing clipped a burst of flak, just a flash, a metallic bang and a shudder through the airframe. He felt the vibration instantly. Oil pressure in the left engine began to drop. He spoke softly into the intercom, left engine hit, feathering prop. He pulled the lever, feeling the vibration ease as the blade stopped spinning. Now flying on one engine 200 miles from base, most pilots would have begun a slow, desperate climb toward friendly territory. Lindbergh instead adjusted his right engine settings, 1600 RPM 32 inches manifold, the same pattern he had drilled into every pilot he'd trained. The vibration steadied. Cylinder head temp dropped back into the green. The lightning held altitude. Hours later the clouds parted. The Luzon coastline appeared ahead, green ridges, rivers gleaming like silver veins. His fuel gauge showed 85 gallons remaining. Enough. When he touched down at Clark Field, the other pilots crowded around. They'd seen him take the flak hit. They'd assumed he was gone. Instead, he stepped down from the cockpit, calm and dry-eyed, his flight log still clipped to his kneeboard. "Engines?" someone asked. "Right one ran like a sewing machine," Lindbergh said, almost smiling. "Left one's just tired." That night, the entry in his logbook was brief. Mission 50. Single engine return. Settings 1632. 5 HR 45 minutes. Fuel remaining 83 gal. Conclusion principle confirmed. A week later, a telegram arrived from 5th Air Force Headquarters. Charles A. Lindbergh ordered to return stateside for reassignment. Officially, his combat participation was to be terminated immediately. Unofficially, he had already changed the doctrine of every Allied airman flying a piston engine in the Pacific. Before departing, he walked one last time through the revetment, stopping to watch a group of young mechanics tuning an Allison engine. One of them looked up, wiping his hands. "Sir, you really think running 'em that slow won't break 'em?" Lindbergh smiled. "Engines don't break from kindness, son. They break from fear." He patted the cowling and walked away into the fading light, a man both out of place and ahead of his time. Within months, his methods were codified into field manuals. Fighter-bomber squadrons across the Pacific adopted Lindbergh cruise settings as standard procedure. The P-38's range increased from 570 miles to nearly 750, in a war measured by gallons that meant victory bought with science instead of speed. And though Lindbergh would never wear a uniform again, his quiet revolution, born of listening intuition and defiance, would echo through every engine that learned to fly farther by flying gentler.